is your real core. So I wanted to do this workshop because I really feel like there's a disconnect between what we consider our core and how we actually spend time building it. Now, if you've done any of the workshops, you'll kind of hear me talk about bits and pieces of your core. But what I want to talk about is I'm going to kind of give you like the anatomy of what we're talking about. But then I really want to get into common ways that people are building their core, how you might be engaging your core, and then how you can kind of change it and make it more effective. So when I talk about your core, what I'm talking about is more than just your six pack, okay? So there's a top to it, which is your diaphragm. There's a bottom to it, which is your pelvic floor. There's a front to it, which does involve your six pack. There's a back to it, and then there's two sides. So it's this whole cylinder. Okay. Now it's not like make sure that you strengthen this part of it, and then you strengthen this part of it, and then you can strengthen this part of it, and then maybe you want to strengthen this part of it. It is how it works as a whole. So it kind of works as a piston. So as your diaphragm moves up and down, your pelvic floor will react to that, and it kind of moves in this like synchronized rhythm. Okay. But it can also, depending on the type of situation, so like where you require more core, there might be more of a holding pattern as this compresses. So it creates a more of a pressurized system. Now, commonly what you see is like, yes, you know that those are the parts of your core, but in order for them to interact efficiently, the alignment is key, okay? Now, if you don't have alignment of part of it, then it's not going to get that full interaction of how your core and your breath and your diaphragm and everything kind of interacts. So I'm going to kind of break down the aspects of it that I see as like common misalignments. And then how you can kind of check on yourself whether you have this alignment, if it's aligned or if it's out of whack. Okay. So if you could kind of think, so this is kind of my analogy of this is the bottom of your pelvic floor and this is your diaphragm, right? So if I'm facing this way, there's a lot of times you'll see either a tip like this, you might see a translation of your rib cage this way, you might see, a more of a tip like this, a tip like this, but you more or less want them parallel. Okay. Now, how you get them parallel is so that you have that interaction and the coordinated function of these muscles. Okay. Now, when we look at our pelvis, the bottom of your pelvic floor runs from your pubic bone to your sit bone, so the bony part of your bum, to your tailbone. Okay. So like that's kind of the hammock that's on the bottom, right? Your diaphragm lives up in your rib cage, and it comes down further at the back than it does at the front. So it's like a dome like muscle that kind of goes up inside your rib cage. So as that drops down, it's going to cause an interaction with your pelvic floor. Now, if you're someone that has your sit bones sitting a little bit closer together, then you're going to have more tension at the front and kind of a laxity at the back. So it's like trying to get like a reaction. So this is kind of a Kleenex. So how well of a reaction will you get if it's all crumpled up like that, and then the front stretched out? So like the back's all crumpled, it's like jumping on a trampoline and part of it doesn't have the bounce left. So you want to make sure that you have that position through your pelvis so that your diaphragm can interact. So if you're only looking at breath stuff and you don't look at the interaction that it has on the bottom, there might be something there missing. Okay. Now there's also, if your sit bones come together, your pelvis tends to flare out. Right? So you might actually either be tipped under or tipped back. So there's always an alignment factor of what your pelvis tends to do. So you can work on, say, maybe if you're tipped like this, and you might work your breath stuff to get there. But if you don't have this connecting, then you're not getting that full connection between the top and the bottom. Okay, so that's mostly in relation to the top to the bottom. There's obviously other things that happen, but just for the sake of kind of keeping it simple, even though it is simple, but it can sound complicated when you start to think about all the moving parts. Now, if you think about, let me see if I can get tubing here. So another thing that can kind of happen is that we get stuck in a state of stress. So if you're someone that works, you're oblique, so you're always doing some sort of twist or something. So I'm kind of connecting, the bottom to the top, right? By tubing. So we'll pretend that the bottom of this doesn't exist. So if I took this and tightened it, and I'm trying to make it even, and it's not cooperating. Okay, so let's say that that's tightened, right? So now if I added a tip, do you see how you get an overstretch or an over-engagement and kind of a lackadaisy here? So if this was the front of your abs, so say your six-pack that you might see is ripped, but then you've got like nothing going to stabilize here, right? So what would happen if I shifted to the front? So do you see how there's going to be a tense, but more of a reaction at the front and more of an over-engagement happening at the back because your body wants to be in that stacked position, right? So now if I took it this way and we're kind of thinking about this being your sides instead of your front and back. So when it comes to your obliques, there's ones that run this way and there's ones that run this way. So if I take my rib cage and kind of shift it forward, there's going to be an overreaction to one versus the other. So you might feel tension in one area, but it might not be like a good functional tension. And there might be like an overreaction of like your muscles trying to pull you back into a certain position. So when you start to explore this area, so this cylinder, right, it's like your foundation. If you don't have a stable foundation that kind of interacts, that can pressurize, that you can breathe and also move, then you're going to have trouble connecting your parts to that foundation. So like, how do your legs move? How do your feet connect to your hips? How do your arms connect to your base? So if there's some sort of crack, right? Like I kind of describe it as if there's a crack in your wall and you keep putting like tape over that crack, the crack is going to keep moving until you address the foundation or the cause of it. So when you start to look at your core, you might be doing all the things that you think you should be doing, but if you're doing it in this type of position, you're not going to get the results that you think you're going to get. So what I want to kind of do today, like everything that I said, like that's all important, but let's kind of bring it back to what we tend to think about in life. Because, I spend most of my career teaching people about this 360 core. And then they'll come after seeing me for, a long time, they'll come and say, well, I've been really working planks. Can you check to see if I'm doing a plank properly? I've been doing sit-ups. And the connection between all this work that we're doing, we still have this brain thought that I need to keep my core tight. So I need to draw my belly button up and in. I need to tighten my tummy before I do something. I need to create that before I start to strengthen, right? So I really find there's a huge disconnect between understanding the stuff that I teach, which is like learning to breathe, learning to open up that pelvic floor, learning how to connect the top and the bottom. But then we still see the other side as I want my core strong. So I need to do sit-ups. I need to do planks. I need to do, push-ups. I need to, all these things that we kind of view as a core strengthening exercise. Now, I'm not saying that that's wrong, but all of the things that I described has to be a part of that. So I want to talk about how you can look to see if those parts are communicating. And if you do choose to do a plank, that you're breathing while you're doing it, that you're not like mentally thinking about tightening a muscle, and are you getting your alignment so that it can be actually easy? So many of us see a plank as super hard, but when you get this 360 communication, it's actually easy. And so my biggest thing that I want to accomplish today is kind of changing your mindset behind what you think is a strong core. Now, you standing here, me sitting here, our core is working. Otherwise, we'd be a pile of mush on the floor. If you've ever seen anyone that's had like a spinal injury or anything where, you know, they really lack that ability to turn on because of neurological deficits, you'll see how just lifting an arm, and if their core doesn't fire, they fall over. So your core is on, but is it on efficiently? And is it communicating to the other parts of your body to make movement easy? I really always go back to can you move from a state of relax? That's why I do so much breath stuff, because the diaphragm is the top of your core. It's also a sphincter to your stomach. It is also pumps blood to your body, which is oxygenating your muscles. And it also stabilizes you and you breathe. But most of us pick one of those things. And when you have that alignment, when the alignment is a little off, you have a really hard time in trying to get to that relaxed state. So my focus today is kind of teach you the alignment, but also let's look at some of the efforts that you're doing, and are they actually doing what you think you're doing? Okay, so now in terms of standing here, most of us will make some sort of an adjustment when it comes to creating a better posture. And what I want you to think about when you go to stand up tall, so like just sitting there or standing like I'm standing, I want you to think about standing up tall, like bringing yourself up into a higher posture. Okay, and you're going to notice that your core turns on no matter where you are or what you're doing, right? Because creating length turns on your core. Now, what I want you to think about is whatever your distance is from your pubic bone to the bottom of your rib cage, and from the back of your rib cage to your tailbone, I want them both to lengthen the same amount of distance. Because usually what I see is this will lengthen and this shortens. So just in that scenario of can you lengthen both sides the same amount of length, you're going to feel your core work differently. Okay. Now, when you do that, so we're just bringing awareness. So now when you go up into that taller lengthened, like you're fighting gravity instead of crumpling to it, when you go to sit up straight, you want to create that length. But now, did you hold your breath? Now, a lot of the times what will happen is you'll create that length, but you're all sucked in and tight and you're not breathing very well. And then you start to breathe up here and then you're like, oh my God, I'm tired. And you want to go back. Okay. So now what I want you to think about, so can you create the length at the front and the length at the back, which, well, your tummy will fire. Now what I want you to think about doing is softening your rib cage down. Do you see how that didn't take away from the length here or here? It's just a softening, because a lot of times when we sit up all the way to our shoulders, where our stability, the first part of your core comes from down here. This is, and I'm not talking about diaphragm, but this is accessory. This is unnecessary. So when you think about standing tall, it's like someone has a hold of your pelvic floor. So think like either your sit bones or your pubic bone or both at the same time. Like, can you create that length where the same amount of length happens at the front as it does at the back? Because most of us like to compromise the back. Okay, our diaphragm drops down further at the back, and it's also the intersection of where your hip flexors start. So one branch of your hip flexors. So a lot of times your hip flexors will take over for what your core should be doing. And when I say core, it's that 360 pressurized system. So if you're someone that has your hip flexors take over, do you see how this becomes lengthened, this becomes shortened, and now my pelvis is dumped? So I went from here, so think about that length, and just creating that length, you're going to get a lot more stacked position. right? Thinking about this lengthening just as much as this. And then if you tend to be hip flexor dominant, you're going to do that. And now I've created stretch at the front and like over engagement at the back. So you'll feel those muscles on your back like engaging, like you'll have the big rods. So a common thing that you can look for to know if you know how to pressurize this is, I call it hills and valleys. So if you have like ridges in your abs, if there's an obvious like cliff, like a lot of us tend to over grip in our abs. So usually that happens because we do this and we know enough not to do that. So then we grip here. And do you see how I still have the arch here, but I know enough to not be here? And then I try to bring my ribs back, but now I'm like, this is like holding on for dear life. So I call it the 2-pack. Then we got the 2-pack to create. And that usually happens from doing a lot of these little crunches, like you're building the 2-pack. So again, when you're doing crunches, when you're doing planks, when you're doing any sort of a lower leg dropping, like any sort of those, you know, typical core exercises, you want to think of alignment. So is your pubic bone, so the front of your pelvis and your hip bone, in the same plane while you're doing it? So if I was in a plank and I go into this position, do you see how my pubic bone is in front of my hip bone? Okay, so if I just think of aligning that, creating the length. So once this is aligned, create just as much length at the front as you do the back. And then breathe. You're going to have a whole different party going on here, because this type of a plank is hip flexor dominant. Okay. And then you're actually, you need to create pressure here, but now you're also gripping in that top 2 abs. It's very typical for these top 2 abs to be grippers. And those grippers actually take away from the function of our diaphragm, which is the top part of our core. And it makes our lower abs super lazy. And that's usually where we get the, you know, the mummy bellies, the Dunlop, whatever you want to call it, right? But it takes away from the ability of this to function. Now, if you have that compensation, which, I mean, it's more common than it's not, and everybody's a little bit different, but if you take that cue of drawing your belly button up and in, and you have a gripper, you don't have a chance in heck of making that easy, because you've now taken away your ability to breathe. You've created a whole heck of a lot of tension, and chances are that thought process of drawing your belly button up and in, which we're going to test, isn't actually doing what you think it's doing. Usually it's gripping more from your area of that function. Okay. So when you're doing a plank, when you're doing laying on your back, so the whole idea of imprinting your back when you go to lower your legs, yes, it's meant to protect your low back. But you don't need to protect your low back if you actually can stabilize here. So creating that length, having the ability to stabilize and breathe back here is what protects your back. That flattening your back cue is because you don't want to see people doing this because ow, over time, but can you keep that neutral position in your pelvis, which yes, you do have a curve in your back. Okay, and can you keep your rib cage stacked over top of the bottom of your pelvis? Okay, so just that thought process totally changes your exercises if you're doing anything lying on your back. And I'm going to show you laying down. Now, if you struggle with keeping your ribs back in those, that's when you're just going to give yourself a little help by putting a pillow under your head. Why turn it into a teeter-totter exercise? Take away the things that you don't need to worry about in that moment, but that will help you create that alignment so that you can get the coordination of your core muscles, your diaphragm, and your pelvic floor, like talking. Ideally, you're only going to get them to talk properly and in all cylinder, that whole cylinder, is if the alignment is there. And really what I teach with all of this is just teaching you how to create that alignment. Now, some people will have a little bit of restriction in certain areas, so that's where you got to start to use props and stuff to help you. Now, if you're someone when you lay flat and your pubic bone sits high, right, you somehow need to get your pelvis to go back, and there's lots of things that you can do, but you always just want to check in, because I don't want you, so if you're someone that their pubic bone sits in front of your hip bones and then you try really hard to push it back to line up and all you feel is your back, that's not going to help either. We don't want to trade one problem for another. So really just be aware of your alignment, because sometimes it's more about what's going on up here. Sometimes it's more about what's going on down here. It's just becoming aware of that alignment and then doing your best to find how you get that, you can best support that alignment. Now, if you're on all fours, so any part of like bird dog or anything like that, you want to again make sure that your pelvis is in neutral. So how you can kind of tell that is when you're on all fours, when you're on all fours and you put the block on your sacrum, you want this, so you can see in the video how it's not parallel to the floor, right? So most people go here, you're gonna see them super loaded in their hands and their pelvis is more tucked under. So that's no different than flattening your back. Okay, so what you want to do is, can you get that block parallel to the ground, but then you might notice that your rib cage drops down, right? So you might get your pelvis positioned properly, but then you might notice that your rib cage drops down. So if I said bring your rib cage back, you're probably going to notice that your pelvis tucks under. So just by changing gravity, so if I change you to here, you can find that neutral here. So is your pubic bone and your hip bones in the same plane? And then you might notice that your ribs are sitting up high. Okay, that's where you can take, like, and this might be a little excessive for a pillow, but if you lift your head and just think of breathing those ribs down, it's going to give you a better alignment. Okay, now to check to see if you can have that 360 breath so that you have the stability at the back, is like dig your fingers in there and then try to breathe low and wide. Okay, if you don't know how to do low and wide, a really good trick is breathe without the noise. So when you breathe in versus breathing out, you'll notice that there's a little bit of a higher pitch to your in versus your out. And now this is the noise that you and you alone hear, okay? So as you're breathing, you want to breathe without that noise, which will actually change how you're breathing. It will help, it'll slow you down, and you might even notice that you might feel like you're going to suffocate. But I promise, it kind of really regulates your diaphragm. So when you take away that noise, so I'm going to be quiet and do it for a little bit, you're going to notice that that breath will automatically travel to the back. Okay, now when I pinch my sides, I can feel the contraction happening at the back, and I can also feel the contraction happening at the front. Now, my goal here is to keep that, so don't lose. Typically, we'll lose it at the back when you lift your legs, right? Because if I lose it at the back, it's that same length. And so can I keep the same distance here as I do at the back? Because most of us, when we lift, it's like you'll notice that your tailbone will drop down. So then what you try to do is flatten to bring it back. And now the only thing working is here. And it's almost taken away your ability to stabilize back here. And now it's hard to breathe, right? So what we want to create is a system that comes from a relaxed state, that you can keep that pressurized system and still be able to move without taking away your breath, without taking away your function, okay? So far, looking at, first of all, when you're doing any ab exercises or even correcting your posture in the day, what do you do to correct it? And can you keep the same length here as you do here, okay? Then you want to check in, is your pubic bone and your hip bones in the same plane? So what I mean by that is if I was to push my pubic bone against a plane of glass, do the front bony parts of my hips touch also? Okay, now in a hip extended position, this is harder for most people. So if you do it with your hips bent, you'll be able to make a little bit more adjustment, because if you're a hip flexor dominant core person, so your hip flexors actually do what your lower abs should be doing, then it's harder for you to get that alignment just because your hip flexors are dominant. And you can see in this, like my back wants to be arched, right? So if I think of, and it doesn't come from, like making that correction doesn't come from squeezing the living bejesus out of my bum. So all I'm thinking about is a really subtle change in my pelvis position, and instantly that turns on my core, and I'm not using or squeezing the crap out of my bum where most people will. And then it tends to be, okay, can I soften my rib cage? Because I do like to translate that forward. So it's a softening. I don't want any of the adjustments to come from force, because one overactive muscle fighting another overactive muscle doesn't change how you work. And you find that you'll just be under more stress and like, oh my God, I can't hold that for very long. Okay, so check your pelvis alignment no matter what you're doing. Check to see if your rib cage is stacked over your pelvis. And the best way to do that is when you create length is, does this lengthen the same amount of distance as this? Okay, you can take away the noise when you breathe. That helps you to bring the breath to the back. When you breathe out, the more you can breathe out, the further down your diaphragm drops. Okay, which means it gets more and more towards the back, which tends to be the part of us that doesn't work as well as the front of us. Because everybody knows belly breath, right? Belly breath is very one aspect of it. There's also breath that should go to the sides. There's also breath that should go to the back. And that's taking that diaphragm through its full range of motion. And the more interactive you get that diaphragm with your pelvic floor, the less you have pelvic floor issues. So getting your pelvis into alignment and stacked over your diaphragm, and then being able to take your body through that full breath. Okay, so if you do anything, just work on exhaling for as long as you can, because that exhale drops your ribs down so that it can actually get to communicate with your pelvis. Okay. Now I'm just going to check my notes. So we talked about alignment. We talked about, oh yeah, so now also we turn you to the side. Now, not very many people like side planks. So what you'll see in a side plank is most people just get really, really good at overstressing their shoulders. And they're trying so hard to get that perfectly lined position, right? Which is no different when you're here. So this is me in a side plank. If I can't get my pelvis into its neutral and talking to my diaphragm without squeezing the living bejesus out of my pelvic floor or my bum or my legs, then give yourself the room to get that connection. So you want pelvis at neutral. Now that neutral is totally in relation to where your spine is. So if I'm here, my neutral will be in relation to this angle, like this angle. So my neutral would be there. No different than if I'm here, my neutral would be that block parallel to the ground. Okay, so when you go into side plank, you want to find the neutral, right? But now what you also want to pay attention to is, are your hips stacked? And then what is your shoulder doing, right? Most of us are really rib cage poppy in this, which stresses the living bejesus out of our neck and our shoulder. So you want to kind of give yourself a connection to your shoulder by, most of us will slightly rotate. Now in that rotation, it actually drops your rib cage back so then you can actually connect to your side. So when I kind of talked about when you're here, right, and if it's popped forward or like this is moving forward slightly, you know how there's tension in one oblique and not in the other? So you want to kind of promote that connection. And if you have to slightly rotate this, so do you see if I can be stacked and I can still rotate this and still be stacked. So having the ability to stabilize actually opens up your ability to rotate up here without losing this connection, which then you don't compromise other areas. So don't think that you can't rotate or play with the rotation in a side plank to kind of get that connection. Another thing you want to notice is when you go into a side plank, most of us are like this. So if you think of the alignment of my pelvis to my rib cage, this is usually a really good indication as to how well you can connect to your core. Now, an exercise in itself might be, can you get your ribs in line with your pelvis, right? So that's just that translation of your rib cage to the side. So you're not really using it, you're just using the tension, and then you feel it all up here. So number one is, can you even align that? Okay, and then when you go to lift, can you lift both the same? Most of us will either launch ourselves, which there goes your ribs, or like, so you want to think that the distance here increases the same amount as it does from here. So when you come up, it's everybody coming up, not one and then the other. Or in some cases, some people will just push their ribs all the way to the other side, and now you're really working the crap out of your shoulder. And you might feel your abs in it, but ideally we want that alignment, because when you get that alignment, you get the ease of the exercise. It doesn't need to be that hard. Okay, so in side planks, it's just playing with that alignment, but you also need to have hip stability. You need to have shoulder stability, and you need to have those connected to your base of support, so to that foundation, in order to make it easy. So if you're sacrificing something, and most of us have a harder time loading into that hip, which will actually take most of the work and make it a lot easier for our shoulder, or we might sacrifice our whole shoulder and hate side planks for life. Okay, so now let's kind of talk about, okay, so just to revamp, we've talked about, what that alignment looks like in general with our 360 core, how you want to bring that alignment to anything lying on your back or anything, all fours, or any sort of a plank. So that's like more of a stationary thing. Now, if you bring that into like a sit-up, what you want to notice is what part is moving and what part is stationary. Because if you're doing a crunch and your pubic bone comes towards the bottom of your rib cage, you're just shortening and you run out of room to get up. Okay, so if you're someone that does this all the time and your pubic bone is coming this way, all you're doing, again, is shortening, and this is lengthening. So do you see how that alignment doesn't really create that 360 core? So you always want to think of, what am I doing and what's the long-term effects of that? So if you're just shortening, and then you go to stand up and you wonder why your posture is like this because you spent years shortening this and not creating that 360 core, then you might want to try to do things a little bit differently, right? So what are you doing, and is it actually accomplishing what we think it's accomplishing? There's nothing wrong with a sit-up, because think of how many times you sit up out of bed. Okay, but I would look at, can you sit up without losing this position? So your pubic bone and your hip bone should be in the same plane, and you should be able to sit up, right, without it running into each other. So, right, and there's a really good exercise for that. If you start here and you think of rolling down, but you don't, like the minute your legs go to lift, or you feel like your hips and your pelvis become one, that's your hip flexor doing it. So it's very similar that if I'm stationary here and I'm like this the whole time, like hovering and lifting, right? I'm not stabilizing well in that 360 core to lower my leg. So I'm bringing in my head, I'm bringing in my neck, I'm bringing in all these extra things. Now, if I take that to standing And we wonder why our posture keeps shrinking. Okay, it's not what you're doing, it's always how you're doing it. Okay, now another common cue that's given out, and again, none of these are wrong, it's just how are you doing it in your body. Now, if you're sitting, if you're standing, wherever you are, what I want you to do is draw your belly button up and in. And then notice what you actually did. Some people will squeeze their bum, some people will grip their abs, some people you'll feel your whole pelvic floor get tight. Now, if you're lying on your back, which I suggest because then you don't have to worry about what everything else is doing, and keep your legs bent. Now what you're going to do is actually stick your finger in your belly button, and now I want you to draw it up and in, or back, or whatever the cue is. You're going to move your belly button. Now, did your belly button move? Right? Most of us didn't move our belly button, but what we do is you grip here, or we might grip down here, or we might grip down here. So now in any of those cues that you've tried to move that belly button, you're not actually moving your belly button, okay? So what I would suggest you change it to is, I use your belly button as a teaching tool, so you can take your belly button and then you can push it down and go, can you lift it up after you pushed it down? Okay, when you pull it up, can you draw it down? So can you control what direction your belly button goes, right? And notice that you're not overusing things. And then can you puff? So I like to call this, because our upper abs tend to be such a gripper, if you were to breathe and thinking about these like puffing up, and can you keep that puff? So it's literally like a wide, like pooching out, for lack of a better word, of your rib cage. Can you keep that and then move your belly button? But don't lose this puff. So a puff and then a draw of your belly button. And what you'll notice is that it now turns on this lower abs that might have been lost before. Because the biggest thing with drawing your belly button up and in, it's not necessarily the cue of that, but what are you doing when you think about doing that? And most people, they're just trying their best to suck their belly button in, and then what happens is we end up drawing our tummy in and we can't breathe, so then we don't hold it for very long. So what happens when you suck your tummy in? So suck your tummy in and then breathe. And do you see how you can't hold that for any like sustainable amount of time? Remember, movement comes from a relaxed state, and we want to find that relaxed, connected foundation so that whatever you're doing is easy. The hardest part is teaching and learning and understanding how you can help your alignment. Okay, so now how you can kind of integrate this into life is looking at the efforts that you tend to do. So whether you're doing planks or you're doing sit-ups or you're doing like push-ups even, if you're doing whatever you're doing where you think you're doing core exercises, or even a bird dog. So when you're here, right, when you go to lift, like, do you go, like, how much is happening through your back, right? It's that whole alignment. Alignment, alignment, alignment. You find the alignment, find your breath connection, find the relaxed state, and then move. Now, there's a big difference between having that tension, but it not coming from a super stressed state. Because a lot of the times people hurt themselves when they bend over to pick up the pen. And you could be like the plank master, but your core needs to be able to move to connect to whatever you're doing. So the more you can set your body up for that alignment, the more your body will stay connected to that alignment in the simple things. Because it's usually, you know, the slippery ground that catches you, or, you know, the stupid things that tend to happen that set us up. Well, it's not that incident. It was something that was building. It was just the incident that your body didn't have the reaction of protection. And usually it's because we become more rigid. So it's really, that's why, in life, that's why the drunks always survive, because they're not like this. They're relaxed and like out of it. So they tend to survive the things that the average person can't, because they're more relaxed in their body and when things happen to you, right? So when it comes to slipping and falling, when it comes to doing things, you want it to come from a relaxed state, because the more relaxed and connected you are, the easier things are. It's just like watching a toddler. They're sitting in a squat. They don't look labored. That's a position of rest. You don't see them, huffing and puffing as they crawl around the living room. So really what I want you to get from this is understand that your core is more than one muscle. You can't train one muscle and expect that the whole system will work together. It's how do you train that whole system? By changing gravities, changing positions, changing what you're doing, moving parts. But it's a challenge of the system, not one specific muscle. And then always pay attention to your alignment, because the better you can get the alignment, the more connected you will feel to your core, but yet you'll be able to breathe. And there's lots of tricks that you can do to help you get that alignment. There's lots of tricks you can do to help get that breath down, really focusing on the exhale where it helps you get to the bottom range of that diaphragm so that you can connect properly to your pelvic floor. And then really paying attention to what you do. So many of us will just in general, will sit here sucking our tummies in and then going, why am I sucking my tummy in? And it could be just a habit. And what you want to do is get rid of all those hills and valleys that you've created. Everything should be smooth, right? You might see divots here. You might see like a crease here. You might see that, maybe this is off here. You might see the big muscles along your spine. What you want is it all to be smooth and connected. And that doesn't mean you can't have a six-pack in that connection, but the more you can have a coordinated muscle contraction and alignment, then the better and stronger and the freer your movement will be in the long run.